You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 20.
For the next 4 days, Burnmaster and his companions trekked east, traveling along a popular trail that led towards the distant Yala Peak. They walked for about 8 hours every day, stopping every 2 hours to rest. The trail passed through a series of small villages, each containing a scattering of old buildings constructed from timber and stone, using techniques that hadn't changed much in the previous 100 years. The villagers, too, seemed like they came from a bygone era, yet they were clearly used to foreign climbers kitted out with state-of-the-art climbing equipment. Isabelle marveled at the fact that this world in the mountains was so radically different from her own. Her home in London felt like it was impossibly far away. The sense of isolation grew with every passing day. Isabelle had never felt anything like it before. Langtang was a barren, almost alien world. As the surrounding mountains got bigger and bigger, she felt smaller and smaller. Wildlife was scarce. Her traveling companions, particularly Laheeti and Twig, whom she never took for granted, suddenly became the most important people in the world to her. She even started to warm to Flat Top. The thought of trekking through this place all alone, like Nicky Zipster had done, made her shiver fearfully. There was great beauty in the Himalayas, she decided, but it was beauty to be shared. The rocky trail in front of her was a bland picture. Shades of brown, gray, and faded green, in stark contrast to the shimmering white mountains on all sides and the brilliant blue sky overhead. She zipped up her jacket. There was no snow on the ground, but the wind was icy. Behind her, Twigger stared up at the surrounding mountains with a mixture of fear and excitement. He was elated to be trekking through the Himalayas. It was a heck of a long way from his simple life on Vavu, not bad for a kid who was born in a shack with a tin roof and a dirt floor. Up ahead, Maine's gaze was also constantly drawn to the mountains and sky. He welcomed the isolation and the loneliness, for every day carried him further away from his life in North Korea. Though he couldn't express it in words, moving deeper into the mountains seemed to satisfy some deep need to return to the wild, to be one with his environment, a desire he had never been aware of until now. His own breath became part of the mountain breeze, the crunch of his boots on the stony ground part of the seismic forces that created the mountains. With every step, Maine became more and more a part of the Himalayas. At each village, Burnmaster and Pemba asked the locals if they had recently seen a young blonde lady traveling alone. Burnmaster was hopeful that he would find Nicky resting up in one of the many villages that were dotted along the trail between Shabrubesi and the base of the Yala Peak mountain range. The 14-year-old's hearts were set on rescuing Nicky at the top of a mountain, but Burnmaster was looking for the easiest answer. There was another reason, too. If he found Nicky in one of the villages, it meant she was probably in good health. But if he found her on the Yala mountain, who knew what condition she would be in? So he and Pemba stopped and asked in every village. Gradually, it became clear that there was no sign of her, and his hopes began to fade. Now he and his companions were approaching the last village marked on his map, and after that, they faced 100 kilometers of uninhabited mountain range. Pausing, he turned and looked back at the others, who were ranged along 50 meters of the stony trail. The orange sun gleamed on the reflective surface of his sunglasses. Lumbering up the trail were the 3 Koreans, being led by Flat Top, none of them showing any indications of tiredness after 3 days of hiking. Further back were Pemba and the 14-year-olds, clustered together in a group and chatting among themselves, endlessly in conversation, or so it seemed to Burnmaster, and then finally Gulbenkian bringing up the rear. Burnmaster smiled briefly. Isabelle, Laheeti, and Twigger had kept good pace for the past few days, despite their heavy packs. Not bad for a bunch of beginners, but the climb to Yala Peak would really test them. Glancing at his watch, he realized they had been walking for over 2 hours. Dropping his pack to the ground, he sat down beside it and pulled out a chocolate bar and a bottle of water. Flat Top strode up and stopped, his gaze on the horizon. His huge head blocked out the midday sun. "What are we stopping for?" he growled. "The next village is less than a kilometer away. The kids can use a break," Burnmaster replied. Flat Top opened his mouth to object, but just then Maine sat down with an exaggerated sigh beside Burnmaster. "Me too," he agreed, "but I'm out of water." "Do you mind?" In the days since they had left Shabrubesi, Burnmaster had got to like Maine and Mohawk. They were friendly, helpful, and above all else, they were team players, all important qualities in climbing companions. Qualities which, as far as Burnmaster could determine, Flat Top did not possess. He wordlessly handed the bottle to Maine, who threw back his long proud locks of silver hair and drank thirstily. 5 minutes later, everybody was sitting on the ground or leaning against a boulder, relaxing. Only Flat Top was standing, still wearing his rucksack. Isabelle glanced over at Pemba. "I'm glad you've perked up now," she remarked. "On the first day you seemed a bit glum, like you didn't want to come on the trek at all." "Really, I don't remember," Pemba replied innocently, "probably just thinking about the robbery." Isabelle nodded and looked back down the trail absently. Then she noticed a slim black shape sniffing around the boulders. "Hey look, it's a dog," she exclaimed, rising to her feet. Laheeti and Twig followed her gaze. "Do you think it's a wolf?" Twig asked. Burnmaster watched it move among the boulders for a few moments. "I don't think so," he mused. "The wolves around here have thick coats and bushy tails. Looks more like a stray dog from one of the villages." "Is it dangerous?" asked Isabelle. "Offer it your hand and find out," muttered Flat Top. Isabelle gave him a dark stare, which he returned. Closer now, the stray dog had a lean, hungry look about it and moved with a light-footed grace along the rocky trail. Isabelle couldn't see any other companions, human or canine, traveling with it, and she felt a sudden pang of sympathy. "I'm going to give it some food," she declared, and looked to Burnmaster for approval. He shrugged and said, "The more you give it, the less you'll have to eat for yourself." "Don't give it food," growled Flat Top. "It'll just follow us around and raid our packs during the night." He threw a stone at it and scored a hit on its rump. The dog yelped in surprise and retreated down the trail. Flat Top chuckled and grunted. "That's it. On your way, you flea-ridden piece of—" He stopped talking when he saw Maine's angry stare, then added, "What? Like we need a dog following us around." Isabelle hurriedly found some biscuits in her rucksack and threw a few in the dog's direction. It gobbled the biscuits down and then trotted up the trail towards Isabelle, sniffing the air as it came. "Looks like you've made a friend," said Burnmaster, standing up and hefting his rucksack onto his shoulders. "But Flat Top's right, we don't really need a dog following us around. So try not to give it all of your food." Burnmaster started up the trail without a backward glance. The Koreans followed. "Humph," muttered Isabelle, putting on her backpack. She gave one more biscuit to the dog, which was now only a few meters away and looking at her eagerly. "It's not nice to be alone and hungry in these mountains, is it, fella?" she said gently. "Might be handy having a dog around," said Laheeti, standing beside Isabelle. "Yeah, they don't call them man's best friend for nothing," added Gulbenkian. "In this case, he's woman's best friend," Isabelle corrected. "I thought I was your best friend," said Laheeti. "You're my other best friend," she explained. "If he's your best friend, you should name him," said Twig. "Okay," Isabelle replied, thinking, "I reckon his name should be Lone Star. Seeing as he's out here all alone and apparently surviving perfectly well, that makes him a star in my book, so Lone Star it is." They started up the trail, with Lone Star tagging along at Isabelle's side. Flat Top was right when he said the last village on the map was less than 1 kilometer away, but he didn't know that the rocky trail became steeper and more difficult. After a while, the 14-year-old's pace slowed down, forcing Burnmaster to stop on several occasions and wait for them to catch up. Maine realized that the thin air was starting to slow the 14-year-olds down. They were now trekking at about 4,000 meters above sea level, having ascended almost 2,500 meters since leaving Shabrubesi 4 days ago. The giant GX was new to trekking in the Himalayas, but he was rapidly coming to understand that it was the difference in elevation between two places, not the distance between them, that made a trek difficult. The thin air made their packs feel twice as heavy. When Isabelle caught up to him, he offered to carry some of her provisions in his own rucksack. Her face brightened at the idea, but then she looked glum. "It's my stuff, so I should really carry it," she said. "I don't want to be a burden on you." Maine encouraged her to take her pack off, and he started to transfer some of the heavier items into his own pack. "The only way you'll be a burden on me is if you make me carry you up the mountain," he said with a smile. Flat Top shook his head in disgust, not realizing that the real reason Maine wanted to carry Isabelle's gear was to stop Flat Top's constant complaining about the 14-year-old's slow pace. Mohawk volunteered to assist Twigger in the same way. When Laheeti looked at Flat Top hopefully, the giant Korean gave him an unfriendly stare. Gulbenkian intervened. "I'll carry some of your stuff," he stammered. Laheeti began to unload his pack. "You mean some more of my stuff," he replied ruefully. "You're already carrying half of it." Gull shrugged and said, "Being strong has its advantages." After the redistribution of provisions was complete, they set off again at a quicker pace. Isabelle gave Lone Star another biscuit when nobody was looking and managed to give him a quick pat on his head. He was starting to trust her. The others may not agree that having the dog around was a good idea, but as far as Isabelle was concerned, Out here in the middle of nowhere, she needed all the friends she could get. And that included the four-legged variety. Even though he was a stray and potentially unreliable, sometimes he darted off to explore the surroundings, but he always returned to Isabelle's side a short time later. They arrived at the last village in the early afternoon. It was a tiny frontier town crouching in the shadows of the surrounding mountains. Pemba and Burnmaster set about asking the locals if they had seen Nikki. 30 minutes later, they had run out of doors to knock on, and there was no sign of Nikki. Returning to the group, they reported the bad news. There was no need for any discussion about what to do next. Everybody was committed to going all the way, which meant climbing up to the Yala Glacier. Burnmaster took the time to explain that it would get harder from here, not easier, and that if anybody wanted to stay in the village, that would be fine. He didn't expect there to be any takers, and there weren't any. Twigger stared up at the towering granite peaks in the distance, only half listening to what Burnmaster said. Pemba wondered what he could have done differently to prevent the trek into the mountains. Isabelle gave Lone Star a comforting pat. Then Burnmaster wordlessly started down the trail, and one by one everybody followed, leaving the last village far behind. Several hours later, the setting sun cast broad orange bands of light across the mountains. For a while, Maine resisted the temptation, but then, against his own better judgment, he took out the camera he had stolen from Nicky Zipster's office and began to take photographs. He paused on the trail each time he took a picture, and soon he was some distance behind his two brothers. Isabelle, who was further back with Laheeti and Twig, caught up with him. "You take a lot of pictures?" she asked, hurrying along beside his long strides. "Not as many as I would like," Maine said. "Is it a hobby or are you a professional photographer?" she asked. Maine frowned. "What do you mean, a professional photographer?" he said uncertainly. "You know, taking pictures for money," she explained. Maine had only just discovered the joy of photography, so the idea that he could get paid to do it sounded too good to be true. "You mean somebody will pay me to take pictures of the Himalayas?" he spluttered. Isabelle shrugged. "If you're good at it," she replied. "Maybe you can sell your pictures to the National Geographic magazine or something like that. Let me see them, I'll tell you if they're any good." She held her hand out for the camera. Maine shied away from the gesture. There were pictures of Nicky Zipster on the camera, and he didn't want Isabelle to see them. "Thanks, but maybe some other time," he replied carefully. "I've got a lot of, bad pictures on this camera. I'd just be embarrassed if you saw them." Isabelle shook her head disapprovingly. "What's to be embarrassed about?" she asked. "It's a digital camera, right? If there are bad pictures, just delete them." "Exactly, I can delete the bad ones," he agreed, except he had no idea how to do that. "I just haven't had a chance to yet. But when I do, you'll be the first to know." They continued on in silence for a while, and then Isabelle said, "You're kind of shy about your pictures, aren't you? I don't know why you take them if you won't let anybody see them." "Seems like a waste to me." She watched as he stopped, adjusted the telephoto lens, and snapped another picture. After a while she asked, "How long have you been into photography anyway?" "Not long," he replied, his attention on the camera's digital screen. "A few years," she pressed. "More like a few days," Maine thought to himself, but he said, "Something like that." "Do you need to take photos as part of your university course in Korea?" she asked. Maine liked Isabelle, but there were times when her inquisitive nature became an irritation. He didn't want to get into a discussion about the camera or his cover story. "Not really," he muttered. "No," she replied, surprised. "I thought you might. You study zoology, right? Like Tom. He's got thousands of photos of animals in the wild taken from all sorts of places. He travels a lot. Maybe when you finish, you'll be able to do the same thing." Maine slowly lowered the camera and let it hang on the cord around his neck. He thought about the life that Isabelle had described, traveling the world, going to exotic locations. To him, it all sounded like a dream. It was the life he wanted for himself, but it seemed so impossible. He didn't know anything about zoology or photography. He had no idea what it was like to go to university. He'd never been to school or a football game or a movie. He had no friends except for his brothers. He didn't even know which buttons to press on the camera to delete the photos. The only thing he knew how to do was hurt people, courtesy of a lifetime of military training. He wasn't free, he was the property of the North Korean army. Isabelle thought he had an enviable future, but in fact his life was a train wreck in slow motion. He didn't know the first thing about the real world and had no way to earn money to survive. He had no place to go except back to North Korea and his life in the army. His life here in Nepal was a lie. He felt like a loser. Isabelle was watching him, waiting for an answer. He swallowed his feelings and tried to smile. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "I feel really lucky. they continued along the trail. It wasn't long before Burnmaster called a halt and picked out a location for them to set up camp for the night. The sun had slipped behind the mountains and the color of the sky had changed to a deep, transparent blue. Isabelle's breath was white with condensation as the chill of the evening crept into the air. The tents were easy to erect, and now that they had had several nights' practice, the process went like clockwork. The sleeping arrangements were as follows. Isabelle and Laheeti were in the same tent as Gulbenkian, and Twig and Pemba were in with Burnmaster. The Koreans each had a tent of their own, and as far as Isabelle could see, those tents were only barely big enough. On the first night after leaving Shabrubesi, Burnmaster made the error of setting up his tent too close to the Koreans, forgetting that they were terrible snorers. In the nights that followed, he found excuses to wait until Flat Top had set up his tent, then pitched his own as far away as he could without being impolite. If the giant Korean noticed anything was amiss, he never commented on it. Burnmaster fired up 2 of the little portable stoves and set about preparing dinner. The Koreans, as usual, made their own arrangements. Pemba waited until everybody was busy with their nighttime routine, then announced to nobody in particular that he was going for a walk to visit the little boy's room. Burnmaster stopped stirring the simmering pots to give him an acknowledging wave. Pemba moved into the thickening darkness, carrying a torch in one hand. He walked over a stony ridge and continued down the other side for a few minutes, until the camp was out of sight and earshot. Then he pulled the sat phone out of his pocket, dropped his pants, and squatted down in the darkness. If anybody came looking for him, they wouldn't come too close when they saw he was answering the call of nature. He dialed Zaw's number and heard the yeti mumble a greeting. "Where are you?" asked Pemba. "On the opposite ridge, about 200 meters in front of you, behind the boulder shaped like a pyramid," Zaw replied. Pemba squinted into the dark. He couldn't see much, but yeti eyes were far superior. "You mean you can see me right now?" he exclaimed. "Clear as day, dude," Zaw chuckled. "You should be ashamed of yourself, taking a squat in front of an unsuspecting person. That sort of thing would get you arrested in Kathmandu." Disconcerted, Pemba shuffled around so he was facing another direction. "Tell Abby to look the other way," he blurted out. Abby, who was standing next to her brother, said, "Don't worry, I averted my eyes the moment I saw you unzip your fly. I don't think I've ever seen Pemba looking so flustered," Zaw remarked. "If you had any human decency, you wouldn't have seen anything at all," Pemba snapped back. "You just answered your own question, dude," Zaw retorted. Abby rolled her eyes and took the phone off her brother. "Don't worry, I'm not looking, I'm just listening, okay?" she explained. Then she saw her brother's look of surprise and added, "I mean, I'm not listening to, I'm listening to the conversation. I don't want to hear anything that I don't want to hear." Her brother shook his head in mock disgust. "Whatever you say, weirdo," he scoffed. Pemba shifted his weight, getting comfortable. His booted feet crunched on rocks. "You've seen where Burnmaster and the rest are camping?" he asked. "Yeah," Abby said. "We sneaked up to where you are now and watched them pitch their tents, but we won't be going back there again," Zaw added, "now that we know what you've done there." Pemba ignored him and asked, "Are you guys going to keep watch on the camp tonight?" "Do you think we should?" Abby queried. "Well, the chance of something happening is small, but," Pemba replied. "Very small if you ask me," Zaw said quickly. "Not worth the effort." "Nobody asked you," Pemba snapped. "It's easy for Pemba to suggest we keep watch because he doesn't have to stay awake all night and do it," Zaw snorted. "Zaw and I will take shifts," declared Abby, ignoring the look from her brother. Zaw threw up his arms in disgust. "That's just great," he exclaimed. "Seems to me that I've got too much responsibility here and not enough respect." "When we get back to Shangri-La," Abby said, "I'll tell them what a good job you did." "Happy? No," Zaw retorted. "What I really want is one of those tents. I'm sick of sleeping under the so-called beautiful stars. I don't suppose Pemba could steal one for me and leave it on the ridge. Far away from where he's squatting right now, of course. I think Burnmaster might notice if one of the tents suddenly goes missing," Pemba replied. "Tell him that stray black dog stole it," Zaw replied helpfully. "Dogs steal food, not tents," Pemba remarked. "Whatever," the moody yeti muttered. "What I don't get is, how come Pemba always gets to have the creature comforts and we miss out?" "Hey," Pemba exclaimed more loudly than he intended. "Do you see me sitting on a heated toilet seat out here? I'm roughing it, too." "Zaw, pipe down," Abby said, giving her brother a hard stare. "It's not Pemba's fault." It was a good idea for him to join up with Burnmaster's group. Speaking into the phone, she said, "Pemba, we'll keep an eye on the camp tonight. Zaw can take first watch and then get some sleep. We'll talk to you tomorrow." She ended the call. In the darkness, Pemba pulled up his pants, pocketed the phone, and started back to camp. When Pemba stepped into the pale light of the camp, he saw that the others were eating dinner. Burnmaster glanced up and indicated the small bowl filled with beef and vegetable soup that was sitting next to one stove. Pemba gave his hands a quick wash using some bottled water and began eating. Lone Star crouched in front of Isabelle, gobbling down the food scraps that she tossed to him. Flat Top watched this pointless generosity and shook his head as he stuffed his own mouth full of food. When Lone Star had had his fill, he paced over to the Korean's side of the camp, lifted one leg and urinated on Flat Top's tent. By the time the giant GX noticed what was happening, the dog had scurried off into the darkness. The scowl on Flat Top's face was pure animal. In dog culture, that's a sign of respect, observed Twig, but Flat Top looked unconvinced. Burnmaster packed up the cooking equipment and instructed everybody to go to bed and get a good night's sleep. A short time later, Isabelle lay awake in her sleeping bag next to Laheeti and Gulbenkian. A blustering wind had started up, slapping against the tent fabric and blowing through the mountains with an eerie high-pitched howl. The tent suddenly felt pathetically small against the wrath of a Himalayan storm. Isabelle thought about Nicky out there somewhere, all alone. She heard Lone Star shuffle around outside. He was curled up right in front of the tent flap. She felt sorry for him out there, but if he was tough enough to survive this long, another night in the elements wouldn't hurt him. Besides, there wasn't enough room for him in the tent. Isabelle's eyes were wide open, but it was too dark to see anything. "Are you still awake?" she whispered to Laheeti. "Yes," he replied. "What about you, Gull?" she asked. "If this wind keeps up, I'll be awake all night, I think," the giant islander stammered. "This is the first bad weather night we've had," Isabelle observed. "And hopefully the last," Gull said. Isabelle was quiet for a while and then asked, "Do you think we'll find Nicky out here?" "I think if anybody can find Nicky, Burnmaster can," Gull said. "That's not what I meant," Isabelle replied. "I know," Gull stuttered. "But sometimes you've got to keep the faith, even when there's no reason to." "Tom's a good reason to," Isabelle suggested. "Yes, he is," agreed Gulbenkian. "Even if we don't find Nicky," said Laheeti, "I'm glad we tried. It would not have been right if we'd just gone back to Vavu without trying." Isabelle was about to say, "I agree," but she closed her mouth. Somehow that answer felt like she had already given up hope. Later that night, Isabelle woke up. The small tent was dark and the wind outside was howling unabated. She listened to Laheeti and Gulbenkian for a while and decided they were fast asleep. Their breathing was deep and regular. Then she realized what had woken her and she squeezed her legs together, not wanting to leave the tent in the middle of the night. She looked at her wristwatch. Sunrise was still a few hours away. She shifted around in her sleeping bag, hoping the feeling would pass. 5 minutes later, she knew she would have to do something about it. Sitting up, she pulled on her boots and laced them up. Her hands found her jacket, and then she unzipped the entry flap as quietly as she could and slipped out of the tent. Neither of her sleeping companions woke up, but Lone Star was waiting for her when she crawled outside. He stood up and looked at her curiously. It was colder outside than she expected. She zipped up the tent and put her jacket on. There was a torch in one of the pockets. She flicked it on and shone it around. It was strong enough to illuminate the Koreans' tents about 10 meters away, but not much more. The tents looked like giant yellow cocoons huddled together. The wind whipped her blonde hair around and she pulled her jacket hood over her head. Lone Star seemed eager to follow her wherever she was going. The sense of isolation in the mountains was strongest at night. The sky was filled with stars, but there was no moon. A thick bank of cloud was building up in the north. She moved away from the tents and carefully made her way towards a nearby ridge. She had seen Pemba disappear over the top of the ridge for a similar purpose, and it would be as private a place as any. Tom had told her never to stray too far from camp when she was alone, but she had Lone Star with her. The black dog paced along beside her soundlessly. Her world was reduced to what she could see in the torchlight. The surrounding mountains were visible only as a jagged black skyline against the constellations in the sky. She crossed over the top of the ridge and went far enough down the other side to make sure she had some privacy. Then she stopped, dropped her pants, and went about the task. Lone Star sat down on the ground, content to wait. She shuffled around, trying to get comfortable. Many of the hardships of camping she didn't mind. In fact, they added to the adventure, but she did miss the luxury of toilets. A simple invention, but wonderfully practical. Squatting down on the ground was irritating, and there was always the possibility that some creepy crawly could sneak up and bite her on a tender spot. Lone Star's sleepy demeanor abruptly changed. His head, which had been resting on his front paws, suddenly snapped up, his attention fixed on the top of the ridge. His nose sniffed quickly at the wind. Isabelle shone the torch at him. "What are you looking at, Lone Star?" she asked. He ignored her, instead rising to his feet, his body tense. His lips curled back to reveal short white teeth, and a low, menacing growl issued from his throat. Isabelle pointed the torch in the direction he was looking, but saw nothing except rocks and low shrubs. "Is something out there?" she asked. As she lowered the torch, she glimpsed 3 dark shapes flash over the top of the ridge in quick succession. For a fleeting moment, they were silhouetted against the stars before being cloaked by the night. They moved like black ghosts, and they were coming towards her. Isabelle's instincts told her they were wolves. She pulled up her pants with trembling hands and stood up quickly. Lone Star glanced at her, then took several steps forward, his gaze shifting from one contact to another in the darkness. He growled again. Isabelle kept the torch moving from one place to another but still saw nothing. It took her a moment to realize that the wolves were between her and the camp. Her only direction of escape was down the ridge, traveling away from the camp. It was then that the danger of the situation dawned on her. She took 2 steps backward, thinking that even if she managed to escape the wolves, there was a real possibility that she would get lost in the mountains. "Lone Star, let's get out of here," she hissed, but the black dog didn't move. Then she saw a pair of glowing eyes hovering in the darkness, watching her hungrily. She paused, momentarily shocked, and her heart began to race. A second pair of glowing eyes materialized over to her left, and a third pair over to her right. The wolves were working together as a team to cut off any escape up the ridge. They were hunting her. Her steps backward quickened, and the gap between her and her unmoving companion grew wider. "Come on, Lone Star," she pleaded. The pairs of eyes ruthlessly closed in on the lone black dog. When it came, the attack was lightning fast. With a snarl, a wolf burst into the torchlight and lunged forward, a flash of teeth and brown fur. Lone Star leapt forward to meet the attack, and their bodies collided and writhed around on the rocky ground. Then the other 2 wolves descended on Lone Star, ripping into him with teeth and claws. The black dog's aggressive growls quickly became high-pitched cries of pain. Isabelle, shocked by the speed and ferocity of the attack, stumbled as she walked backward. She turned the torchlight away, not wanting to see any more. As she listened to the sounds of Lone Star dying, her voice caught in her throat. Then she screamed and ran. The terrific wind tore her shrieks from her lips and carried them away. Abby woke up suddenly. She was lying in a shallow gully that offered some protection from the wind that was tearing through the mountains. When she had gone to sleep that evening, there had been little wind, but her instincts told her a storm was coming. She had kicked away the larger stones to make a comfortable spot, not exactly a bed but good enough for a yeti in the wilderness. Pushing the hood of her jacket off her face, she stared up at the stars in the night sky, wondering what had woken her. Then her ears picked out the snarls of some wolves in the distance. That focused her attention, but it was the other sound that caused her to sit bolt upright, the sound of a human girl screaming. Her brother was lying beside her, sound asleep. She shook him by the shoulder roughly. "Zaw," she exclaimed, "you idiot, you're meant to be up on the ridge watching the camp." He rolled over and muttered, "It's too windy up there." Abby jammed an elbow into his ribs. "Wake up, something's happening. I think Isabelle's in trouble." He sat up and rubbed his eyes. "What are you moaning about?" Then he stopped talking and listened intently. He heard it too now. In the distance, somebody was screaming. And there were snarls of wolves. "Oh no," he breathed. He raced out of the gully. Abby was right behind him. His sharp eyes saw Isabelle, 100 meters up the ridge, running for her life with 3 wolves hot on her heels. At this distance, he could see the blood on their jaws. Had they already killed one of the other humans? He wondered. Even as he watched, the predators were closing in fast. Isabelle had only seconds to live. Zaw sprinted up the ridge, adrenaline pumping, heading straight for Isabelle and the oncoming wolves. In the tents on the other side of the ridge, the GXs woke up at precisely the same moment. The only difference was that Flat Top lay in his sleeping bag for a while, listening to the distant screams, whereas Mohawk and Mane leapt out of their sleeping bags and hurriedly woke up Burnmaster and the others. Terrified, knowing only that the wolves had killed Lone Star and now they were after her, Isabelle ran along the rocky terrain as fast as her legs would carry her. The danger was horribly close, yet some part of her brain refused to accept that she was about to die. She could hear the growls and the scampering of claws on stones, but she dared not look back or slow down. The wolves, sensing an easy meal, quickened their pace and moved in for the kill. When the lead wolf was only meters away, it leapt forward, its jaws wide open, lunging at its prey's slender neck. Zaw bounded up onto a boulder and leapt into the air, rocketing over Isabelle's shoulder and colliding with the airborne wolf like a freight train. The teenage yeti, claws fully extended, caught the carnivore in a vice-like grip and forced it down to the ground. The wolf's eyeballs almost popped out of its head in surprise. Himalayan wolves were dangerous hunters and well-respected in the animal kingdom of the mountains. But this wolf had just come face to face with the creature at the top of the food chain. In a blind panic, Isabelle was vaguely aware that a large red thing had flashed over her shoulder, but she didn't turn around to see what it was. A heartbeat later, a second object darted past her in the darkness, after which there came a pitiful yelp that was inconsistent with the hungry snarl of a predator about to strike. But still she dared not stop. Zaw snapped the neck of the wolf and let its dead body drop to the ground. It wasn't difficult. He was twice as heavy as the animal and at least twice as strong. He had killed several wolves when he was a kid, and his parents always chastised him for it. He turned in time to see Abby slash a lethal cut in the second wolf, which caused it to collapse and lay on the ground, unmoving. The third and final wolf had stopped pursuing Isabelle and was looking at its fallen companions uncertainly. Its earlier courage had evaporated. Zaw sprinted after it. The wolf was fast, but the yeti were the quickest creatures in the mountains, on 2 legs or 4. Grabbing its hind legs, Zaw held it up in the air and watched it snap at him. He couldn't risk letting it go, not with Isabelle still out there in the darkness. Moments later it was dead. There was a cacophony of yelling from the direction of the camp. Zaw looked around and saw the yellow flashes of torchlight as Burnmaster and the others hurried over the top of the ridge, calling out Isabelle's name. Abby hurried over to her brother. "Let's get out of here before they see us," she said. Zaw hesitated. "What about the wolves' bodies?" he replied. "If Burnmaster sees them, he might start wondering what happened." "So what if he does?" she asked. "Well, there's not many animals in these mountains that can kill a wolf," Zaw explained, "and I bet Burnmaster knows that." Abby glanced up. The torchlights were getting closer. "He'll never be able to work out that it was a couple of yetis, though," she suggested. "No, but he might start wondering what it was and why it didn't kill Isabelle," Zaw pressed. "Well, it's too late now," hissed Abby, backing away. She grabbed her brother by the arm to get him moving. They retreated further back on the ridge, far enough for the distance and the darkness to conceal them from the humans. They watched as Burnmaster jogged down the ridge, continuing to call out for Isabelle. When he saw the bodies of Lone Star and the wolves, he paused to examine them. After discussing the matter with Gulbenkian, the pair led the way down the ridge with increased urgency. "When the whole group has passed by, we'll remove the black dog and the wolves," Zaw said, watching as Flattop turned a wolf over with one of his boots. Abby shook her head. "What's the point?" she said. "They've already seen them. Removing the bodies will just make them suspicious. Dead wolves don't just get up and walk away by themselves." Suddenly Flattop's head snapped around and looked in the direction of Zaw and Abby. The yetis froze. To Zaw, it seemed as if the giant Korean was looking straight at him, even though he was more than 100 meters away and the night was almost pitch black. After a while, the Korean glanced away and returned to examining the wolves. "There's no way he could hear us," whispered Abby. "Not upwind. No human can hear that well." Zaw nodded, but he wasn't sure. There was something strange about all 3 Koreans, he just hadn't quite worked out what it was. There was a joyous exclamation from further down the ridge, followed by the sounds of human laughter and crying. "I think Burnmaster just found Isabelle," Zaw whispered.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.